You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. You can find out more about Grace Fellowship Church at www.gfcbaker.org.
Joel, this is our fourth time trying this podcast today. It's been crazy. My camera was acting crazy for a while, restarted my computer, think we got it fixed. Then we recorded almost the whole podcast, but didn't record it.
Yeah.
And now we're 42 seconds into what I hope is the one that takes.
Now your camera looks great and mine looks weird, but whatever.
I think this, as the sun is setting on our happiness, you're getting darker and darker.
Give myself a little more room light.
Yeah. Anyway,
let's talk about it all again.
We'll talk about it all again. Where we started, and I was really happy to talk about this, was the music. And so I mentioned that I really appreciated us singing I Stand Amazed. And I thought, man, that goes so well with the sermon. You had to have picked that out. And then it just made me think, well, actually I want to talk about music in general and how you think about whether or not it's necessary and if you make an effort to match the songs you pick with the passages we'll be in. And just throw that out to you.
Yeah, it is something that I think about a lot. I think about a lot of other things too when it comes to music. So I'll think about who I have on the team that week, how big my band's going to be, what instruments I'll have. I think about tempos of songs, like whether a song is fast and high energy or kind of slower and more reverent. And I try to do a mixture of those things. I try to think about how often we've done certain songs, so I don't want to do a particular song all the time. So I try to mix up the frequency a little bit. I think about keys, all these kinds of things. And then somewhere in there too, I think about how the songs that I pick will pair well with your sermon. And this week, though, was really a week that I didn't give it much thought from that perspective. And usually we'll talk during the week, and so I'll know what you're preaching on. I try to do my song choices pretty early in the week, but it doesn't always work out that way. So, but anyway, yeah, this is one week that I didn't give a lot of thought to how it paired with the subject matter, but with God being sovereign, and we know that He is,
right.
It'll often turn out that we see those connections anyway. And so I'm glad that happened this week.
Yeah. So the connection that I felt made it a really strong connection between I Stand Amazed and the passage we were in is the relationship between the song and the Mount of Olives, or the Garden of Gethsemane, which is connected to the Mount of Olives. The song says, "For me it was in the garden, he prayed, not my will but thine. He had no tears for his own griefs, but sweat drops of blood for mine." And that, in my mind, was an obvious connection between David's hike up the Mount of Olives, and he goes weeping and crying and the misery and the grief that he was going on, his exile, and then Christ's exile that begins, I say exile, his Via Dolorosa that begins. One way to track it is to begin it there at the garden when he's betrayed by Judas, and even before that when he's praying, "Not my will, but yours be done," there. And so,
yeah,
I don't know. I thought it was a really cool connection.
Yeah. I
will say, for what it's worth, and in my mind, it's fun when those connections work out. I know there are some people who believe that it's nice when there's a very tight connection between every single aspect of the service. That's not my philosophy or my view on it. I think I view it more like a meal. So the church service, if you think about it like a meal, that you want some meat and some vegetables and some fruit, and what you want is a balanced diet. And so we want in the service to have something that feels Scripture saturated throughout. If there's anything that is more than anything else, it's Scripture. It's on the front, it's in the middle, it's in the songs, it's in our prayers, it's in our study together. But as that goes, the whole service, it's fine for us to be thinking about all kinds of different things as we go along, believing that a full course meal will nourish us in different ways throughout. And so rather than being like, oh, we're going to eat only chicken themed things today, just eat a balanced and a full meal. But sometimes you find out, man, those things paired really well together. And when that happens, it's just a fun thing.
Yeah, that's cool.
So,
That's a good way of looking at it. So
well,
with your sermon now, this was part 2 of your Via Dolorosa duo of sermon. I guess there's only a part 2, right? There's not a part 3.
Yeah, no, part 3.
Yeah, so Via Dolorosa, that Latin phrase meaning way of sufferings, often used with in terms of Christ and his road of suffering that he walked from Jerusalem to Golgotha, where he was crucified. But you are applying that now here to David, because there's so many ways that David looks forward to or foreshadows what happens to him, foreshadows what happens to Jesus. And so David is on his way out of Jerusalem, and you started at chapter 15, verse 30. Sorry, my voice is cracking a little bit.
That's because it's our second go through now.
Yeah, I mean, we've been at this for a while now. So you started at verse 30, and step back, looking at this whole 2-part sermon series you kind of been doing. There are 5 different interactions that David is going to have on this road out of Jerusalem, and you mentioned that 3 of them are with people who are kind of on David's side. They're going to be good interactions, things that clearly are encouraging to David and are clear evidences of God's hand with David. And then there's going to be 2 that are more negative interactions, people who are not on David's side, and people who in different ways are against him. But still, you made the point through all of it that God's goodness is still there and still present with David, even in the bad situations and the bad interactions, just like they are with the good interactions. And so last week you did the first 2 of those interactions, and then this week you did 3, 4, and 5. And so that started at verse 30, and then you went on through chapter 16, verse 14. So with that, starting at verse 30, there's a little bit of setup, and that is that David is ascending to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he goes. It's a very, very sad situation, a very sad picture. And one of the things that David is told is that Ahithophel is one of the conspirators with Absalom. So Absalom is David's son, who has kind of staged a rebellion and is taken the throne by force from his dad. And so David gets the news that Ahithophel is basically on Absalom's side. And Ahithophel was a friend of David, and that's one of the things that makes it so hard for David to hear, because and you connected it to Psalm 55, that where David says, it's easier to bear it when it's an enemy who is against you. It's way harder to bear it when it's one of your own friends. And I think we can all feel the weight of that and this that David is going through. So talk a little bit about this kind of these 2 verses that set up the rest of these interactions that David's going to have.
Yeah. Well, I will say something I mentioned just in passing, because I tried to focus on David's story until the end more than all of the connections. But I did try to bring out that, man, this looks a lot like when Judas also shows up, and one of the 12, and he betrays Jesus. And we're not there yet, but Ahithophel's going to end up hanging himself, and that's Judas does too, right? And so, man, I just think God wrote both stories, obviously. No surprise there. So, yeah, it's a betrayal. David is totally just brokenhearted. And you already mentioned there's a couple Psalms, but Psalm 55 is the one we looked at, where he's just talking about, I could handle this if it was an enemy. Yeah, that stinks, but I can handle that.
You expect it from an enemy.
When it's your friend,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever felt that it is easier to be kind to strangers than it is to your own family sometimes.
Yeah.
Right? I think part of that, like, not to excuse our own bad behavior, but part of that is that we're more emotionally invested. And so somebody driving down the road flips you off, you don't care, you don't know that person. But if your own wife is acting that way to you, well, that's like, it cuts worse. Hopefully she's not flipping you off.
My mom does that to me.
What
I'm thinking,
was happening?
that's a little bit weird, Mom. Do you often flip people off on the road?
I think I laughed so hard that I must have busted the mic on that one. But I shouldn't use flipping people off references in this. But do you know what I mean? Like, there is a smaller offense from somebody you love hurts worse than a bigger offense from somebody you don't know. And that's why David's pains are so high right now, that this was a good friend. Now, it's also true that he was a good friend, but he was also a respected advisor. He was considered to be the most wise. And so if he's advising Absalom, then it's scary enough that Absalom's strong and young and he's a good fighter, but Ahithophel, if he's giving him counsel, then Absalom's going to be unbeatable, because Ahithophel knows what he's doing.
So good. So, well, not good. Not a good situation for David.
Bad
but
start.
Yeah, moving on into these last few interactions. The first one is with a guy named Hushai, the Archite. And this was somebody who, it may have been the case, you mentioned that he was an old man because of, because of what David...
Maybe
Go
before
ahead.
we get to Hushai, we should mention that two things happen, even in spite of his heartbreak. It's probably worth saying that David's response to his heartbreak is prayer and worship, right?
Yeah.
So,
That's right.
I'm brokenhearted, so I pray, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness, and then he goes and worships. And I believe that those two things, once Hushai gets here, we're focusing on the provision of God, but I think here we're looking at the humility of David, because prayer and worship are signs of humility. Not always. There is a way to pray that's not humble, and there's a way to worship that's not humble. We looked at that in Matthew 6. Jesus says, don't pray like the people who use big words and say, everybody look at me. That's not humble worship. But when you're suffering, the short, simple prayer of, Lord, I need you, and the laying down and worshiping God and saying, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I believe you're here. You're in control. I don't understand what you're doing, but I know that you're doing something, and I'm trusting you.
Right.
That just takes humility to do that. And it's a really good sign that we see David praying and worshiping in the face of suffering.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about the example of Job as well, as he lost all that he had, his family, his livelihood, and yet he, in that moment of just unimaginable grief, he falls down on his face and he worships, and he says, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Right.
And it's just a reminder to me that there's never a time that goes by, no matter what, there's never a time that goes by when God is not worthy to be praised. And that's what you see in here with David, even in the midst of all these things that are falling down, falling apart around him. He prays and he worships. So that's really good.
Yeah.
So with Hushai the Archite, you mentioned he might have been an old man based on what David says to him here, if you go on with me, you will be a burden to me, because he comes
Yeah.
out and he wants to go with David and he wants to support David and be with him. But David says, if you go on with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I'll be your servant, O king. Basically, if you go back to Jerusalem, be a part of Absalom's team, what David says is, you can act like kind of a spy for me. You can send me word of things that are going on and keep me
Yeah.
informed on everything that's happening. And so go back and do that for me. And so what is it? How do we see God's goodness with this story or this interaction that David has with Hushai? How does that work itself out?
Well, it is that David's prayer is in verse 31. The answer then is in verse 32, right? Hushai comes up.
Yeah,
with
yeah.
him. And so
That's right.
it is a direct answer to prayer. I did read in Matthew 6, Jesus says, listen, don't be crazy and try to impress God. Pray, and pray humbly and with a level of meekness, because God actually already knows what you're praying about before you even pray it. And I thought that was a neat connection here, that it's as David is praying,
Yeah.
the answer to the prayer comes up to the summit of the mountain. So how long did he have to leave before David
Yeah.
prayed in order for God to answer the
Yeah.
prayer when he prayed?
God was already in the process of answering the prayer that David hadn't prayed yet, probably.
That's right. So the sovereignty of God, in some ways, like, I'm answering this prayer, but I'm going to do it in connection with your prayer, not because your prayer is what made it happen, because I'd already started the journey before you ever prayed it, but because I want you to understand that prayer is effective. Right? Like, in some way, God says, I want you to talk to me, and I want to meet your needs as you pray. And I think that's part of something that's happening here. Just a really fun little detail.
Yeah, that's good. That is how the counsel of Ahithophel will be turned into foolishness and
That's
be
right.
foiled, basically, by
Yeah,
Hushai
yeah.
being there and being able to keep David informed on what's going on.
I first wrestled with, does David know that God is answering his prayer or not? I'm convinced now that he is. In verse 34, he doesn't
Yeah.
say, return to me and maybe you can do some good for me. He very specifically says, return to me, then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel, which to me suggests, I understand why God has sent you to me. He sent you to me as the direct answer for a specific prayer that I've prayed. And so
Yeah.
I think David understands God is doing something good here.
Yeah, that was really good. And also a point you made here is the interplay between God's sovereignty and our actions and our efforts. So, David doesn't take a let go and let God perspective here. He does accept Hushai as God's blessing to him, but he then kind of gets right to work in putting forth effort and making plans for how to then act on that and how to be a steward of that blessing that God has given him. So the sovereignty of God and what God does works alongside of our efforts and our actions too. And you brought that out of this story.
Yeah. I hope that I think I've told you before that I get a little bit nervous when I attack a cliche, right? I think cliches, the problem with cliches is that they're short and, there's 4 words, let go, let God. And so it's not going to be robust and you can poke holes in a cliche.
Yeah, bumper sticker.
Yeah, a bumper sticker slogan obviously is going to open itself up for criticism. But I think it can be said in ways that we're completely fine with. And we would say, let go and let God. And so I don't really mean to slam the slogan. I mean to slam the way that we might use that slogan to say that genuine trust of God means not doing anything. So genuinely trusting God means that I make no effort in regard to this. Otherwise, I'm trusting myself and not God. And I think, no, David sees the provision of God. He thinks God's providing, and therefore he makes a plan. And so I think the implication for us is that the provision of God does not mean we don't do anything.
Right.
You trust that God's providing, and you do something.
Yeah.
So we talked earlier, like an application for this. You pray, God, give me a job. That does not mean, well, if I apply for jobs, God didn't give it to me. I applied for it. No, you pray, God, give me a job, and you fill out your job application. Or, God, give me a wife. Well, all right, but also ask a girl out, right? I mean, like, view those as, I want God to provide. I'm submitting to him. I'm obeying him. I'm not dating anybody that he would forbid me to date. But I'm also not saying, God, give me a wife, and I stay in the basement 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where I would never meet people, and then complain, well, God never put a girl in the basement, right? That sounded creepier than I meant it to sound. But.
And clip that out of context.
Yeah. So just, I mean, and I think we talked about Kevin DeYoung's book, Just Do Something.
Yeah.
I consider this to be the most helpful book I've ever read on making decisions, right?
You got to read it for me because it's backwards for me.
Just do something. It's not quite able to focus on it when it's that close.
There it is.
Right.
There it is.
How to make a decision. Well, first off, it's a liberating approach to finding God's will. How to make a decision without dreams or fleeces or impressions or open doors or random Bible verses or casting lots or liver shivers or writing in the sky, etc. I love the book.
Great book. Liver shivers.
It's super short, so short books are nice books. And I think he uses the word liberating. I find it very freeing, right?
Yeah.
So, man, I'm so stressed out. I have this big decision to make, and how do I know I'm going to make the right decision? And his point really is that there are godly parameters that we follow, and so we know we don't disobey in certain ways, and we put godly priorities in our life. But then we also expect that God asks me to do things and to step out and to be proactive. And so if you have a job in front of you, you pray and say, God, help me make the right decision. But you also make your decision with a level of confidence and assertiveness and belief that God is directing your path. And that should be a freeing thing to believe.
It reminds me of something that Joab said in 2 Samuel 10. So this was just a few chapters ago. But he says, I found it. He says, be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So he's saying, he's appealing to the sovereignty of God, but not as a way of saying, let's just sit back and do nothing, but let's go. Let's not be afraid here. Let's march out onto the battlefield and do what God's called us to do. And let him do what seems good to him. Let God do what seems good to him. So really the phrase could be better stated as let God and then get to work or something like that. I don't know. But I agree with you, though, that the phrase let go and let God is not always bad and not always used in a irresponsible way. And so sometimes there is some care to be taken in how you kind of gently push back against well-known phrases like that. And it makes me think about in Ecclesiastes 3, where the writer says that there's a time for everything under the sun. There's a time to weep and a time to dance, a time to hold on to something and a time to let go. There's a time for everything. And I think we could apply that to even just something like using a phrase like let go and let God. There's a time for it. But there are also times when it could be used in a way, like you've already mentioned, that is irresponsible, in a way that's not wise, in a way that's not helpful. And so I think part of life under the sun is just learning to have the wisdom, and for God to give us the wisdom to see when things apply and when they don't, when it's time for this and when it's time for that. And so
right,
that's another thought I would throw along with that. And so that's Hushai. Anything else to say about Hushai before we move on to chapter 16? Ziba,
no.
next guy.
It might be neat just to say in verse 37. So in verse, I guess 30, or no, verse 31, Ahithophel, your good friend, has betrayed you. And then in verse 37, but Hushai, David's friend, came into the city. And he wasn't a friend maybe in the same way that Ahithophel was, but God provided not only the answer to his prayer, but God provided him a friend. And I think that's that's a nice thing.
That's good. Very good. So moving on into chapter 16 now, we get Ziba, a guy named Ziba, who was a servant of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the grandson of Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. God rejected Saul as being king and gave the kingdom to David. And so that's sort of what we've seen really over the course of all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, that story first of Saul and his reign, and now the kingdom is David's. But now David's in a place of having the kingdom taken from him by his own son. So we're in the thick of that whole drama right now. But Mephibosheth is Saul's grandson. I've often said that Mephibosheth is one of my favorite characters in the Bible that people never talk about, or that is more lesser known. And he was, when he was a boy, he had an accident and ended up being crippled for life after that. And so whenever things go south with Saul and Saul dies in battle and the kingdom is in the process of being given to David, it's easy to see how Mephibosheth might think, oh, well, I'm toast. There's no way David's going to let me live. He's going to do away with the house of Saul completely. But David ends up showing compassion to Mephibosheth and inviting him in to sit at the king's table, and he takes care of Mephibosheth. And I like to think about that in relation to communion and how Jesus invites us to his table. He's the true and rightful king, and we deserve nothing. We are crippled in our sin. We are broken, and we deserve nothing but his judgment. But he invites us to sit with him at his table. That's just a powerful thing that always comes to mind when I think about Mephibosheth. But who we're talking about now is a servant of Mephibosheth named Ziba, and he comes along, and what does he do, and what's the point of it all? Yeah,
I'm curious if it made you nervous when you find out your hero starts having some some bad things said about him.
Yeah, betraying David. What's going on?
So before we get to what the accusation of Mephibosheth is, I guess it's worth saying that Ziba has basically two interactions with David. I mean, it's one big interaction, but you can think of it in two parts. The first part is David seeing him on the mountain and saying, whoa, what in the world is going on? Because he has just an absurd amount of food and wine and provisions for David. A handful of donkeys probably pulling carts and just crazy amount of provisions. And he says, I'm bringing all of this for you. I'm bringing it for you and all the people traveling with you. It will be enough to carry you all the way through your journey in case you are faint or weak along the way. This is, I think, obviously the provision of God. I can't imagine somebody not seeing this as the provision of God. I think it is parallel. Now, one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet, but in addition to looking forward to the cross of Christ, I think it was looking backward to the exile of Israel. And I think that in this way, it's a parallel to the way God provided manna for the people of Israel during the exile. Yes, I'm taking you through the wilderness, but I'm giving you the sustenance you need to sustain you. The sustenance to sustain. Anyway,
it works.
Yeah. So anyway, he's that's what he's doing, and I think in essence, he has brought Ziba to bring the manna of God to the people of God who are in the wilderness right now. So great.
Ziba's a good guy.
Yeah, great. I mean, so excited. Wish the story ended there, and it would only be a happy story. But David seems suspicious, right? It's a little sus. Where is Mephibosheth?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this is the part that confused me in verse 3. The king said, and where is your master's son? So
Yeah.
the master there is Saul, is
Right.
what you're saying?
Right. The master
Okay.
is Saul.
Because Ziba
And-
originally was a servant of Saul.
Right. And then really it on a technical level we would say the master's son is Jonathan and Mephibosheth is his grandson. But
Right.
in Hebrew, son can mean descendant, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to mean like it can mean son or grandson or great great grandson. And so David is Jesus is the son of David because he's
Right.
the descendant of David.
There's a lot of people between them, obviously.
That's right. That's right. So, he's where is your master's son? So, why not say where's Mephibosheth, or why not say where's your master? Because Mephibosheth is his master right now. So why not just say where's your master? And I believe that he is highlighting the relationship between Ziba and Saul.
Yeah.
And then he's going to do it again in the next story with Shimei, that this is a relative of Saul. And
Yeah.
so then you have to ask, well, why? Why is it a big deal that these two guys are related to Saul? I think there's a couple possible answers to that. One is that all of this wilderness experience, David is reliving being in flight, right? He was running from Saul for all of 1 Samuel almost. And now he's running again. So there's some connection of David is back where he used to be. But I think probably more than that, well, or at least equal to that right now, is that these two men, Shimei and Ziba, are loyal to Saul, right? They are on Saul's team, and Saul was an enemy to David. David was not an enemy to Saul, but Saul was an enemy to David. And it's letting you know these guys, they're elite. They might do things for David at different points, but their heart is with their master, Saul. So you should expect a little bit of bad guyness in them because of their connection with Saul. And I think that's really the point here, is to kind of make you a little bit suspicious of what is getting ready to happen next.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. And so he asks where Mephibosheth is, and then how does Ziba respond?
Yeah, so Ziba says he thinks this is his chance, right? You're out of the town, and he's going to seize control of the kingdom, and which is an absurd thing, right? I mean, everybody knows that Absalom's taken over, and Mephibosheth isn't going to roll himself into the throne room and take over. But that's the claim. And David seems to believe it.
Yeah, because he says, okay, well, then you can have all Mephibosheth's stuff.
That's right.
So,
That's right. It is my belief, I can't prove this, but I think that it is reasonable, and there's some hints toward it, that this was Ziba's goal all along. So that Ziba was never trying to provide for David, except that this was a ploy for him to get out from under control of Mephibosheth.
Yeah.
So I'm not even sure that Ziba was entirely loyal to Saul. When he was under Saul, he was Saul's top servant. Then when Saul dies, David gives him, or he just takes control over all of those estates, because he was managing the estate of Saul before. Saul dies and Saul's children all die, and Ziba becomes the executor of all that Saul owned. And then one day David shows up and it's like, aren't there any descendants of Saul left? And he says, well, there is this one guy. He was only 5 when he left. He's crippled. He's not really, he's not really worth anything. He doesn't really, you're not really sure where he stands with Mephibosheth. David brings him in. That's probably fine until David says, now everything that was Saul's belongs to Mephibosheth, and Ziba, you're his servant again. And then we just move on from the story with, oh, how awesome that is that he's, David was so kind to Mephibosheth. Ziba, I am imagining being like, man, I just owned this whole place.
Can't
and
catch
now
a break. Yeah. When's it my turn?
Yeah, exactly. And so that is the backstory that is at least in my imagination. I think there is reason
Yeah.
to believe that's
That's reasonable.
a good guess. And so what he is doing now is throwing Mephibosheth under the bus in order to get out from under Mephibosheth's rule and to become the master of his own domain again.
Yeah, so Ziba does end up, despite, it's good having all this nice food around, Ziba does end up taking advantage of David and manipulating him in order to get what he wants, and he kind of throws Mephibosheth under the bus. It will be resolved, though, later, right?
Sort
When
of,
Mephibosheth comes back.
Sort of. I mean, we'll have to say that from when we get there. David sort of splits the kingdom between the land between them, and you're like, why, David? And it's possible that David's not sure who's telling the truth. There's some other possibilities going on. We'll talk about that when we get there. But you do see that David, I think it's clear when we get to chapter 19, that David was too quick to trust a negative report. So he hears this negative word against Mephibosheth, and he just accepts it. And what David should have done was heard both sides of the story. Right? You'll have to help me again. Proverbs 18 says, the way of a man seems right until someone comes to examine him. Something like that.
Yep.
Another expression that's like that is God gave you 2 ears so you can listen to both sides of the story, right?
I like
and
that.
that's what he doesn't do. He doesn't listen to both sides. He listens to an accusation. He accepts the accusation. He makes a decision based on the accusation. And that's actually not just. It's not. We're not allowed to make decisions, particularly against somebody, without hearing their side of the story. And
That's right.
So what David does is actually not in a section that's mostly good about David. That's not a good thing for him.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to him in the sense that what he's getting over and over and over again is let down by people that should be loyal to him. His son, his kingdom, his best friend Ahithophel, and now Mephibosheth, who he took in and was like a adopted son to him. And now he hears that he's turned, and it seems to me that David's mood is like, all right,
everybody's against me.
Another
so.
betrayal. Yeah. Yeah, and so he's primed to accept that to be true. And I think when you have been lied to, you begin to think everybody's lying to me. You begin to have a very cynical and skeptical view. And I wonder if that is happening to David a little bit here. It doesn't excuse it, but I guess I'm just saying I'm not sure that I would have been better. Right.
And yet even though David's making a bad decision here, and even though somebody's taking advantage of him here and deceiving him, he's still got a lot of good food to eat.
Yeah. Right. None of that negates the provision of God, does it?
Yeah.
David is not being provided for because he's perfect, and he's not being provided for because Ziba is a good man. God is using a selfish, manipulative liar, I think, to be the hand of God to bring provision to David. And that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And encouraging.
Yeah. It's not the first time in the Bible that's happened, and won't be the last, right? So Joseph said to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God meant for good.
Right, yeah.
Peter's going to say in Acts 2, Jesus, it was according to the predetermined plan of God that the Jews delivered
Pilate
Jesus up, and
all these different people, all these different actors were brought together to do
they murdered
what God's hand. Yeah. Evil. Yeah.
To do evil.
To do what God's purpose had planned to take place or predestined to take place.
And that's the provision of God, right? That's so I find that, I don't know how you feel. I find that moving and encouraging and exciting that people who intend evil for us, even they are in the sovereign control of God.
Yeah.
And no matter what they do to you, they can't do to you something that God doesn't let them do for your good if you
Yeah.
love him and are the called according
Yeah.
to his purpose.
No, for sure, it's encouraging to me. I mean, there aren't many things more encouraging than that.
Yeah.
To know that, like Paul says, our present sufferings are building for us an eternal weight of glory beyond compare.
Right.
That because of the things I go through, whether they're things that just happen to me randomly or things that are intentionally done against me, by other people, things that I go through, things that I suffer through in this life, one day I'll see that heaven will be more glorious for that reason, for me having gone through those things.
Right.
And we can't see and know exactly what all that looks like and entails, but we can trust that it's true.
Right.
And there is nothing more encouraging to me, I would say,
Yeah.
than to know
So
that.
I used that to transition in the sermon to transition to Shimei because I said, you know what, I am really encouraged that God can give blessing through an ungodly source, right? So that God can give me something good from a person that's bad. But what if God gives me cursing through an ungodly source? Am I quite as happy to receive that?
Yeah. So moving on to Shimei, then he's this guy that comes out. It says that he's from the family of the house of Saul, and so again, you see that theme there of Team Saul, and coming against David, and he kind of reminds me of like Antifa protesters that you've seen on TV. They hurl out every profanity under the sun. They throw bottles, curse, all these things, and that's kind of the picture I get of this guy. That he comes out, he's throwing stones at David and all the servants of David, and he says, "Get out, you man of blood, you worthless man." So, not a fan of David.
No, and not even like a reasonable man with a complaint, like a wild man.
Yeah.
He's just crazy.
He's done trying to reason with people.
What do you think? We talked before, and I think that he believes that David was unjust to Saul, like that David took the throne in unjust means.
Yeah, well, that's clearly in the background, I would say.
Are you sympathetic with that view?
I mean, I haven't thought about it too deeply, but
I'm not sympathetic in the sense that the Bible says
David's wrong.
Yeah, the Bible says that's actually not true, right? I mean, I think it's told us over and over and over. David didn't do the things he's accusing of.
David had every opportunity to take out Saul, and he wouldn't do it multiple times.
That's right. That said, I can imagine how the facts could be twisted and that Shimei could gain that belief that David did stand to gain from the death of Saul. People kept trying to kill Saul and his children for David's sake, and David had to be like, don't do that. But everybody knew that if those guys would die, everything would be easier. And some people did kill his descendants, like Ishbosheth, for instance.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine him sitting there in his bitterness and nursing the details that he's emphasizing in his head and being really convinced that I don't care what anybody else says, I know the truth, right? And I guess I can see where that comes. But the Bible says it doesn't matter what it looked like to him. The truth is David took great lengths. He went to great lengths to make sure that he never struck the Lord's anointed. And so regardless of what you think happened, what truly happened is different. And so Shimei's not only wild and crazy, he's a slanderer. What he's saying is not right, and it's not true.
Yeah. And so Abishai comes in, and he's like, let's get some peace and quiet here by cutting off this dude's head.
Do you remember when I said Dale Ralph Davis said Abishai must have noticed that men do much less cursing when they have no head,
Yeah,
or something like that. But
very true.
Very true. Yeah, that's right. And so,
And
at
then
first,
and then you see there still that heart in David, I guess, to not want to, swiftly carry out judgment on somebody. I mean, you saw that with chances he had to do that with Saul, but even here, he's not wanting to be vengeful. He's not wanting to, kill Shimei. He instead says, no, don't do that, and even kind of rebukes Abishai for thinking that way.
So many of the commentaries are like, oh, the sons of Zeruiah, they're so hot-headed. They always want to resort to violence.
Yeah.
One of them, and I can't remember which one it was now, mentioned, well, not so fast. Abishai is effectively acting like the Secret Service. Here's a man yelling, cursing, throwing stones at the rightful king. He knows that all of this is lies and slander. What he's saying is actually not unjust, right? Like Abishai's willingness to take off his head. Obviously, David's going to stay his hand.
Mm-hmm.
But Abishai's not as unreasonable as you might think, right? David's the king, and this guy is attacking him. He's lying about David. He's cursing. He's a crazy man. He's throwing later on, it says stones and dust, which I would assume is mud or dirt or something grosser. I mean, I kind of understand where Abishai's coming from.
For sure, yeah. But where he says in verse 10, David says, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?"
Yeah.
I did get the feeling that he was saying there, like, that's how you guys act. Not how I act.
That's right.
I don't know.
I do think that's true. I think that's exactly what that means. Like, you and I handle things differently.
Yeah.
And so what makes him so different is that he says, actually, what I believe is that God has sent him to curse me. Right? And he says, in verse 10, he's like, well, what if God has done this? And then in verse 11, he says, actually, no, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. And I think, like, that's a wild thing to say. Now, I didn't mind it at all when we said Ziba is a bad guy, but he brought the provision of the Lord because the Lord had told him to bring the cart. Ziba didn't even know the Lord had told him, but God directed him there to do it. I'm surprised and impressed that David says, well, if God can use Ziba to bring me blessing, he can bring Shimei to bring me cursing. Yeah. And that's
even
to me,
when
exactly what he does.
Even when I don't have a cart full of bread and raisins and fruit, and instead I've got this crazy dude following me, throwing stones at me, throwing every name under the sun, and they show up weary at the Jordan, it says at the end of the passage, verse 14. Still God is in control, and God is acting for David's good, and David is even producing humility in David, or at least we see that evident in David to know. And this was one of the strongest points of your sermon, I felt, at least for me personally, where you brought in that Spurgeon quote, where the effect of it was basically that whenever people are saying all kinds of things about you, one way that you can deal with that is to realize that if they really knew you, then they would have a lot worse things to say.
That's right.
And so I think for a lot of people in that situation, they would think if they really knew me, they'd know that I was a good person, and I'm, all that stuff's not true. But the reality is that we all know our hearts, and if we all have the humility to say, no, I know the things that I'm guilty of, and I know what's in my heart, and I'm glad that other people don't know those things. I'm glad that my enemies don't know those things, because if they did know, then they would really have something to criticize me for.
Yeah.
So that's
right.
That's a humble posture to take, for sure.
It is true. It's hard. If you've ever been falsely accused, the urge to defend yourself is so strong. I want people to know that's not true. I want them to, that urge of self-justification. And I'm not saying there's never a time that you should defend yourself and say, well, that's not actually true. I think that there are times that you need to set the record straight and be clear for everybody's sake. But the spirit of what is happening here is that David is recognizing, I can't justify myself before the Lord here, right? If it's the Lord that's saying you're guilty, he knows the whole story. And it doesn't matter what Shimei thinks. It doesn't even matter what I think. What matters is what the Lord thinks.
Yeah.
What passage is it?
1 Corinthians 4 is where Paul
Yeah.
says, I don't know of anything against myself, but I'm not therefore justified. God is the one who judges. In other words, even though I may not be able to point, I don't know what wrong I may have done. That doesn't mean therefore I'm innocent, because God at the end of the day is the one who judges me. And so that's very much the kind of heart that David shows here with how he responds to Shimei.
That's 1 Corinthians 4.
1 Corinthians 4, verse
That's
4.
good. That's so good.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I think that's meekness. That's what we're seeing as meekness. It's really very, very similar to a story in Moses' life where Miriam and Aaron accuse him, and I think we talked about that last week, and he doesn't defend himself. God comes and defends him and strikes him with leprosy, but says because Moses wouldn't defend himself, he is the meekest man on earth. And David is showing a similar kind of meekness here. And I think that's the whole point of the wilderness, is to get the children of God to a place where we say before God, yeah, I deserve the wilderness, but I believe that you saved me through it. Right? So this is where I deserve to be. We deserve to be kicked out of the garden. We deserve to be in the wilderness. There's nothing wrong when God leads his people, or any person, out of the garden, away from him, into suffering. That's the right penalty of sin. But what he also does in verse 12 is says, but I'm hoping that God will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. Everybody differs on translation. I said that in the sermon. I'll mention it a little bit more here real quick. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me. Could also be translated the wrong done by me. And and then one other thing is it's actually very similar to the word I. So is maybe the Lord will look upon my I. And there are a number of people that believe that is a poetic way of saying upon my tears or my misery or my weeping, maybe the Lord will see my brokenhearted. So maybe the Lord is looking upon the evil that's being done to me. Maybe the Lord's looking upon my evil, or maybe the Lord's looking upon my repentance. But then that's setting up, whichever one you choose, this exchange, right? He's going to repay me, and that word repay would be to pay instead of, right, to exchange his good for this man's cursing. So this man's cursing is what I deserve, but maybe he won't give me what I deserve. Maybe he'll give me good instead of what I deserve. And so that's what meekness is ultimately for the Christian. It is the belief that I deserve sin and hell and death forever. And yet, maybe God will give me life instead.
Yeah, that's good.
And we say not just maybe. We know that he does that through the son of David, who walks the Via Dolorosa himself later.
Yeah. Going to have to pause. I'm sorry. I'll do the editing later if I can, but I cannot hold it anymore. I got to go to the bathroom.
Go to the bathroom. That was awesome. That could definitely be a commercial for Depends or something like that.
Yeah.
No, we're not editing that out.
Okay.
We're going to let it sit
Sorry, everybody.
for all 5 minutes.
Wow. All right. Well, we were close to the end, and I was really trying to do it, but
That's
couldn't
okay.
do it, sir.
I ended by saying that Jesus was the Via Dolorosa is how we're not just hoping that he would save us. The Via Dolorosa is of Jesus is how he saved us. So let's actually, Joel, if you're ready, we'll move to the very last, the ending. I'm curious how you felt about my move from this story to Galatians chapter 3 at the end. And I just mentioned that the curse that is on us is the law, right? So, and I said, you know what? You have a Shimei in your life, and that Shimei is not actually a human being. It's the law of God that follows you everywhere you go and yells, you worthless man, you man of blood, you son of Belial. And anyone who tries to live by the law has that curse on them. I felt like that struck me as sort of illustrating a passage that we've studied many times before. And I don't know, it sort of helped me see that passage come out in a new light, perhaps, comparing it to how annoying really Shimei is. But David said, I'm not going to shake him. And you can't cut his head off. Because it's like you can't cut the law's head off.
Yeah.
You just have to, at the end of the day, accept that it's the truth.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that even if what Shimei, if the content of his accusations was not true, when it comes to the law against us, its accusations are true. Yeah. And, the devil as the accuser has a lot to work with and a lot of true things to throw against us. And it reminds me of that Martin Luther quote. One of the famous things he said is that when the devil throws your sins in your face and declares that you deserve death and hell, tell him this: I admit that I deserve death and hell. What of it? For I know one who suffered and made satisfaction on my behalf. His name is Jesus Christ, Son of God, and where he is, there I shall be also. So, yeah, that curse of the law is for sure against us. But through Christ, God has taken that away from us, that we're no longer under the curse because Christ became the curse for us.
I love it. Yeah. I found that ending to be, for me, the most encouraging part is if I'm willing to be like David and accept that the curse is true, right? That the law that yells guilty is true. I can also stand like David and say, but maybe God will take what is true and replace it with what is good, and he'll replace his good for the cursing. And I know that not only does he do that, he does it by putting the curse on Christ and the cross. And that's how I'm given the goodness of God on a judicial level, but also on a fellowship level, because he ends that saying, because this is something I didn't bring out, but the wilderness represents division from God, right? When the people of Israel, or when Adam and Eve sin, they're kicked out of the garden and they're kicked to the east, and they go out from there to represent that you're separated from God. And the people of Israel come back west. They cross the Jordan, they go back west into Jerusalem, or into Hebron, really. That's the promised land that flows with milk and honey, where God is again. To say to be reunited with God is to rejoin that relationship. But here what he's saying is it's not with Christ. And here I mean Galatians 3. When Christ takes the law, he gives you his spirit, right? The purpose of taking the law was to put his spirit in you so that you can be reconciled to the power of his spirit. So it's now that we're not even in the land of God, that God is in us through his spirit, that the reconciliation is made complete through the death of Christ. And I think it's a cool image.
Very good.
Yeah. That's it. I do
It's a
think.
good message.
Well, thank you.
I enjoyed thinking back over it.
One of the things that I skipped at the very end, a couple little thoughts out of verse 14, and verse 13 and 14. Really, I didn't talk about them much, and we might just mention them again next week. I think it's really interesting that at the end of this, into verse 12, it seems like David has learned his lesson, and yet Shimei keeps following him and throwing stones and cursing him anyway. And this to me is a challenge to any of us who go through suffering and we think, if I just learn my lesson, then it'll all go away. If I can just say the right prayer or do the right thing, all the suffering will go away. Yeah. And I don't think that's usually the way it works. It's not. Right. It's not like there's this one thing. If you could show your faith, or you could pray the right prayer, or get the right prayer oil, or whatever it is, then it all goes away. The story is not that God took Shimei away. It's that he walked with David through all of this suffering at every step, and that God was with David in spite of David's sin. And so I think that part of this is a reminder that humility is not a magic pill that means you'll never suffer if you're humble. It's that because of humility, you're able to suffer and walk with him and enjoy him.
Yeah, that's good.
The other thing I liked in verse 14, two things. He arrives at the Jordan River and he's weary, he's tired, and he rests there. And there's just something human, and yeah, that's exhausting. All of the betrayal and all of the suffering and all of the cursing and having somebody follow me and yell at me wore me out, and I needed to rest. And I don't know.
Maybe that's where Shimei finally gave it up and went home.
Maybe so. And then there's one last thing, and no commentator I saw dwelt on this, but for whatever reason it stood out to me. You're going to be the first commentator when you write a commentary on these books. You'll be the first one to bring up this point, whatever it is. Go. But I said it to say, take this with a grain of salt. But he arrives weary at the Jordan, but it doesn't say he crosses over the Jordan. And to me, it's used throughout this whole story, the word wilderness and the word wandering, to sort of imply that he's in the wilderness, but he's never actually taken all the way across the Jordan into the land where God wasn't. Like, God takes him there, he takes him through this journey that reenacts it in some way, but he never actually lost his relationship with the Lord through any of this.
That's good. And I think you said something at the front end of the message about that. Like, does my sin, does my faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? And at the end of the day, the answer is no. Yeah. God remains faithful even if we remain faithless.
The whole way through, God remained faithful. So, all right.
That's good.
I think I'm next week and I'm going to finish out chapter 16, I'm hoping to. And then you'll be up in 17 the week after.
Sounds good. And we'll be here again next week.
All right. See you, man.
See you later.
Bye.